Sitting with me in the studio, Jerome, Starkey, defence editor at The Sun. It's quite a kind of difficult one, isn't it? That conundrum about when is something too dangerous for it to be accessed for pleasure and to satiate curiosity rather than for research purposes or something scientific.
I mean, different people get their thrills and excitement in different ways. You know, some people drive fast cars, some people jump out of aeroplanes, some people are much more easily satisfied, some people feel the urge to spend $250,000 and to dive to 4 kilometres below the ocean floor. I mean, it's a difficult space to try and, you know, make. I mean, ultimately, this is in international waters. You know, people can do as they wish, and it would be a difficult thing to try and regulate to prevent people from doing this. Clearly, America could introduce legislation which would say that, you know, submersibles on its, which dock in its ports or which launch from its ports might have to meet certain standards. But ultimately, people will continue to do dangerous things, and they'll put themselves at risk. I think it becomes a problem if by putting themselves at risk, they're putting other people at risk. Now, this rescue, whilst very, very difficult, challenging because of the physics and the size of the search area, wasn't actually, you know, the rescuers themselves weren't putting themselves in particular danger, you know, like you might see on a mountain if mountain rescue have to go and get someone, you know, there where you have sort of amateur walkers getting into trouble, you know, because they can't read a map or because they haven't read the weather or they're trying to follow a phone which has run out of batteries. You know, there they're putting teams of mountain rescuers in sort of real danger. I think that was slightly different in this case. So in that sense, you know, the 5 people on board the Titan, whatever their motivations, the people at most risk from that voyage, and clearly the only people who've sadly lost their lives are the 5 people on board that submersible.
Absolutely. Very often discussing this story in the last few days, I've had a rear admiral on the programme, various military personnel and everything else. They talk a great deal about military-grade submarines, which it sounds to me, and I'm hardly any more than anybody else, you know, a submarine expert, but it sounds as if there's a world of difference between the sorts of submarines used by our forces, or indeed the forces of various other countries around the world, and this submersible, which is a whole different sort of vessel. Is that right?
Well, that's right. I mean, militaries have a range of submarines and submersibles, and the nature of the submarine service in the UK, we refer to it sometimes as the silent service, is it's often shrouded in secrecy, because what happens below the waves is one of the few places on the planet where military activity can take place undetected and in secret, away from the prying eyes of radars and satellites. The UK generally operates 2 types of submarines, an attack class, the Trafalgar and the Astute class submarines, which have sort of land attack cruise missiles, and the nuclear armed Vanguard class submarines. Now, both of these, you know, operate, the exact capabilities are secret, but I understand they operate at around or a little bit below 200 metres below the surface. Nothing like the depths that the Titan was going to. Now, having said that, nations do also have other capabilities. We know that the Russians have a specialist submarine which is known to have dived to about 2,500, 3,000 metres below sea level, and that's used to, well, it appears to be loitering around undersea cables. So exactly what the Russians are using it for is unknown. And then, of course, there are these specialist devices, the sorts of things that have been used to descend into the Marianas Trench, the deepest known part of the ocean, and submersibles like the Titan and the others that have been used to visit the wreck of the Titanic for decades.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the technology, it's very complex. The pressures are huge, but it's not new technology that the Titan was using. But the Titan's clearly was unclassified. It hadn't been tested. It hadn't been there'd be no sort of assurance process of the physics.
Well, one more sort of technical question for you. I'll just introduce you to people who've just turned on either the radio, the TV or the app. You are defence editor at The Sun. That's why I'm volleying these questions in your direction. So a former Royal Navy submarine captain called Ryan Ramsey, you may or may not be familiar with him, says that one of 2 things happened with the same result, and the result was the collapse of the Titan's hull. What he said is that the possible reasons for this catastrophic implosion, he says one of 2 things could have happened. One, the hatch with bolts used to seal the crew in from the outside suffered a failure that caused the hull to collapse, or the pressure hull itself had a defect or a crack that fractured from the pressure and caused the same result. He said he also had a sense that taking a 19-year-old, a teenager still, on the Titan was not okay? I mean, not okay is a kind of sort of hedging your bets kind of a thing to say, but not okay that 19's too young to go on a journey that hazardous, that perilous. So is that what you understand probably happened? And what do you think about a 19-year-old going on a voyage like that?
Well, I do know Ryan. I know he was a captain of a Trafalgar-class submarine, and he's very, very knowledgeable about these things. I mean, in terms of exactly what happened, I don't think I'm expert enough to speculate on the mechanics, on the physics of how that submersible, the Titan, may have been destroyed. And I think, you know, we'll look to see that. I'm sure there will be some sort of forensic investigation from what they can salvage. We understand they found the tail cone. That isn't part of the pressure hull, the sort of tapering end of the Titan, but they've also recovered, we think, the two dome ends of the submarine, and that might reveal what's happened. I mean, in terms of taking a 19-year-old to the bottom, I mean, that 19-year-old, Suleiman Daoud, he was an adult. He's a consenting adult. We have to, at some point, allow people the free will and responsibility to make decisions for themselves. And we know he was with his father. There have been suggestions that Suleiman was really there at his father's behest. I mean, that is a sort of agonising thought, and that, you know, the legacy, you know, I'm sure his father wouldn't have wanted to really put him in harm's way in that way. I mean, of course, equally, Ryan, I'm sure, will have taken 19-year-olds to see 19-year-old submariners in the Royal Navy. Clearly, those submariners would have been encased in a vessel, in a boat, in a submarine that's significantly safer and better tested.